November 19th, 1967. Hill 875, Central Highlands, Vietnam. 330 American paratroopers are climbing a jungle-covered mountain 6 kilometers from the Cambodian border. They're moving toward the crest when North Vietnamese machine guns open fire from every direction. Rockets scream through the trees. The Americans are walking into a carefully prepared kill zone. By the time the sun sets, 87 paratroopers will be dead. 130 will be wounded. 3 will be missing. But the Sky Soldiers will not break. They will not run. They will hold that hill through 4 days of hell. They will fight hand to hand in the jungle. They will call artillery down on their own positions. And when a Marine jet accidentally drops a 500-pound bomb into their perimeter, killing 42 of their own men, they will pick up their rifles and keep fighting. This is the story of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the first major American Army combat unit to set foot in Vietnam, the only unit to make a combat parachute jump in the entire war. The Sky Soldiers, 1,790 killed, 8,500 wounded, 13 medals of honor, 6 years of continuous combat. This is their story. March 26th, 1963, Okinawa, Japan. The United States Army activated a unit that would become legend, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the only separate airborne brigade to exist in Army history. These men weren't part of some massive division. They were a self-contained fighting force. Quick reaction, rapid deployment. America's emergency response team for the Pacific. Brigadier General Ellis Williamson took command. He understood what this unit needed to be: the toughest, the fastest, the most capable paratroopers America could field. The training was brutal: mass parachute jumps, jungle warfare exercises, physical conditioning that pushed men to their absolute limits. They jumped in the Philippines, they jumped in Thailand, they jumped in Taiwan, and it was in Taiwan where they earned the nickname that would define them forever. The Taiwanese paratroopers watched these Americans descend from the sky. They watched them operate, they watched them train, and the Taiwanese gave them a name: Tien Bing, Sky Soldiers. The nickname stuck. These men wore it with pride. The shoulder patch showed a wing to symbolize their airborne status: red, white, and blue, the colors of the nation they served. But the soldiers themselves had another name, a rougher name, a name that came from the ranks, the herd. That's what they called themselves, the herd. And they prided themselves on being the toughest fighting men, not just in Okinawa, but in the entire United States Armed Forces. Their theme song came from the television series Rawhide. Rollin', 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 keep them doggies rollin'. These men were ready, they were trained, they were fierce. They just didn't know that in 2 years they would become the first American Army combat unit to step foot in Vietnam. And they would stay there for 6 years, fighting, bleeding, dying, creating a legacy written in blood and courage. May 7th, 1965. Bien Hoa Air Base, South Vietnam. The 173rd Airborne Brigade landed in country, first major United States Army ground combat unit committed to the Vietnam War. History being made with every step off those aircraft. The mission was clear: defend Bien Hoa Air Base, protect American assets, engage the enemy. These Sky Soldiers hit the ground running. Within days, they were conducting operations, patrolling, making contact, learning the jungle, learning the enemy. This wasn't training anymore. This was the real thing. Bullets that killed. An enemy that fought smart and disappeared into terrain that offered 1,000 hiding places. But these paratroopers adapted. They learned. They became hunters. The Australian Army attached the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, to the brigade. The New Zealand Artillery, 161st Battery, joined the fight. This wasn't just an American unit anymore. This was a multinational combat force, the only one of its kind in the entire Vietnam War. American paratroopers fighting alongside Aussies and Kiwis, brothers in arms, united in purpose. The Sky Soldiers introduced innovations that would change how the war was fought. They were the first unit to go into War Zone D, deep jungle, enemy stronghold. They went in to destroy base camps that the Viet Cong had been using for years. They developed small, long-range reconnaissance patrols, small teams moving through hostile territory, gathering intelligence, finding the enemy, calling in the big guns. These men operated differently than anyone else. They were aggressive. They were bold. They went looking for fights, and they found them. November 8th, 1965, War Zone D, 17 miles north of Bien Hoa, Operation Hump. The mission was simple: search and destroy. Find the Viet Cong Q 762 Regiment. Destroy them, drive them out of War Zone D. 400 paratroopers from 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry moved into position. These were young men, most barely 20 years old. Some had never seen combat before. Others were veterans of previous operations, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming. Company B and Company C settled into a defensive position southeast of Hill 65. Triple canopy jungle. You couldn't see 50 feet in any direction. The heat was crushing. Humidity so thick you could barely breathe. Leeches dropped from the trees. Red ants crawled over everything. The jungle itself was an enemy. The paratroopers carried M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, grenades, claymore mines, ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies, radio equipment. Each man carried 70 pounds of gear in that heat, climbing hills, pushing through jungle, searching for an enemy that could disappear like ghosts. But these Sky Soldiers were tough. They were trained. They were ready. Or so they thought. At 0600 hours on November 8th, Company C began moving northwest toward Hill 65, moving in tactical formation, point man out front, machine gunners on the flanks, officers and NCOs keeping the formation tight, every man alert, weapons ready, safety's off. The jungle was silent except for the sound of men moving through vegetation, the creak of equipment, heavy breathing, boots on jungle floor. At 0800 hours, everything exploded. The Viet Cong opened fire from prepared positions that had been invisible seconds before. Machine guns, automatic weapons, grenades, RPG rockets. The sound was deafening. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Over 1,200 enemy fighters had set a trap, and the Americans had walked right into it. The lead squads were cut down in the first volley, men falling, screaming, dying before they could take cover. The jungle erupted in smoke and noise and chaos. But these Sky Soldiers didn't break. They hit the ground, returned fire, began fighting back even as friends died around them. Staff Sergeant Andrew Matoski was leading the point squad when they encountered an enemy squad in North Vietnamese uniforms. Matoski's squad opened fire immediately, professional, aggressive. They eliminated the entire enemy squad before it could warn the main force. But Private First Class Julius House, one of Matoski's men, took the first wound, shot, bleeding, but still fighting. Company B moved to reinforce. They heard the gunfire, heard the calls for help over the radio, and they ran toward the sound of battle, not away from it, toward it. That's what paratroopers do. When your brothers are in trouble, you run to help them, no matter what. The fighting became hand to hand. The Viet Cong were trying to close distance, get inside American perimeter, negate the advantage of air support and artillery. They charged up the hillside shoulder to shoulder, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. American paratroopers fixed bayonets, steel against steel, men killing each other at arm's length in the jungle. The most primal form of combat, the most brutal. The heat was unbearable. Men were passing out from heat exhaustion, dehydration, but they kept fighting. The noise was deafening. Automatic weapons fire from every direction, grenades exploding, men screaming, some screaming orders, some screaming in pain, some just screaming because they were scared and fighting for their lives. The smell of gunpowder and blood and death filled the air. Cordite, hot metal, the copper smell of blood, the stench of burning jungle when napalm hit. These smells would stay with the survivors forever. Trigger flashbacks decades later bring them back to Hill 6-5 in an instant. But the paratroopers held their ground. They organized defensive positions. They established fields of fire. They called in artillery support, and the artillery came screaming in. 105mm howitzers from An-K, shells impacting with massive explosions. The ground shook, trees shattered. The shells came screaming in, scorching the jungle, catching Viet Cong fighters ablaze. Some VC soldiers were caught carrying ammunition and grenades when artillery hit. The explosions ignited their munitions, men burning alive, dying in agony, war at its most horrific. Air Force F-100s roared overhead. The sound of freedom, the sound of American air power coming to save American lives. They dropped bombs, 500-pounders, 1,000-pounders, creating explosions that lifted men off the ground. They dropped napalm, jellied gasoline that stuck to everything it touched, burned at over 1,000 degrees, created walls of flame 200 feet high. The jungle burned, trees exploded from the heat. The Viet Cong scattered, ran, tried to escape the inferno, but the survivors regrouped, came back, attacked again. The Viet Cong commander knew that if he could get close to the Americans, they couldn't use artillery or airstrikes. They hugged the American positions, tried to get within meters, close enough that American fire support would kill Americans too. They launched shoulder-to-shoulder assaults up the hillside, hundreds of men charging at once, trying to overrun the Americans through sheer numbers and aggression and willingness to die. But the Sky Soldiers held. They poured fire into the attacking waves, M60 machine guns firing bursts, tracers lighting up the jungle, M16 rifles on full automatic, magazines emptied, reloaded, emptied again, grenades thrown into the attacking formations, explosions tearing through enemy ranks. The Americans held through 2 massive enemy assaults. They held as their friends died beside them. They held as ammunition ran low and they started rationing rounds. They held because that's what paratroopers do. Sky Soldiers don't retreat. Sky Soldiers don't surrender. Sky Soldiers fight until there's nothing left to fight with, and then they pick up rocks and keep fighting. Private First Class. James Kelly was a machine gunner. His M60 was crucial to the defense. That gun could put out 800 rounds per minute, create a wall of bullets that nothing could cross. Kelly fired until his barrel was glowing red hot, until the gun jammed from the heat. He cleared it, kept firing. When he ran out of ammunition, he grabbed an M16 from a wounded man and kept fighting. That's the kind of warrior the 173rd bred, men who didn't know how to quit. The Viet Cong finally broke contact late in the afternoon. They had taken massive casualties from the artillery and airstrikes. Their attacks had failed. They scattered into the jungle, dragging their dead and wounded with them, fading into terrain they knew intimately. The Americans held the field, but the cost was heavy. 49 Sky Soldiers killed in action, 83 wounded. Some wounded so badly they would never fully recover, missing limbs, shattered bones, wounds that would define the rest of their lives. The medevac helicopters came in, UH-1 Hueys with big red crosses on white backgrounds. Dust off, the most beautiful sound in Vietnam, the sound of salvation. Pilots bringing those birds into landing zones that were still taking fire, hovering while wounded men were loaded aboard. Door gunners firing M60s to suppress enemy fire. Every helicopter crew member was a hero. Every mission into a hot LZ was an act of courage. And in the midst of that hell, one man became a legend. Specialist 5th Class Lawrence Joel, a medic from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, assigned to Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry. Lawrence Joel was 26 years old, African American, a professional soldier who took his job seriously. His job was to save lives. And on November 8th, he saved more lives than anyone could count. Joel was shot in the leg early in the battle. The bullet tore through muscle and tissue. The pain was excruciating. He went down. Blood poured from the wound. Most men would have called for help, focused on their own survival, waited for another medic to treat them. Not Lawrence Joel. He could hear wounded paratroopers calling for help all across the battlefield. Men crying for medic. Men bleeding out in the jungle. Men who would die without treatment. Lawrence Joel tied a tourniquet on his own leg, stopped his own bleeding, and then he crawled from man to man, treating them, saving them. He couldn't stand because of his wound, so he crawled, dragging himself through the jungle, through enemy fire, bullets cracking overhead, grenades exploding nearby. Joel crawled to wounded men and treated them, stopped their bleeding, gave them morphine for pain, bandaged their wounds, held pressure on arterial bleeds, saved lives one after another. For hours he worked, shot, in pain, exhausted, but never stopping, never giving up. He crawled over 200 meters during the battle, treated over a dozen critically wounded men, saved lives that would have been lost without him. When he finally ran out of medical supplies, he took supplies from other wounded men who had died, used those supplies to treat the living. When a wounded paratrooper was trapped in an exposed position under direct enemy fire, Lawrence Joel crawled out to get him, dragged him back to safety, treated his wounds. The man lived because Joel refused to leave him. Other medics were killed trying to reach wounded men. Joel survived through luck and through the covering fire of paratroopers who saw what he was doing and protected him as best they could. When the battle finally ended and medevac helicopters evacuated the wounded, Lawrence Joel was finally evacuated too. His leg wound was serious. He needed surgery, months of recovery, but he had done his job. He had saved lives. For his extraordinary gallantry, for his courage beyond measure, for his selfless sacrifice, Specialist 5th Class Lawrence Joel was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the first living Black American to receive the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. The ceremony was held at the White House. President Lyndon Johnson presented the award. Joel stood at attention, still recovering from his wounds, as the citation was read, as the medal was placed around his neck. And the paratroopers who survived Operation Hump never forgot what he did, never forgot how one medic with a bullet in his leg refused to quit until every wounded man had been treated. That's the spirit of the Sky Soldiers. That's the heart of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. No man left behind, no matter the cost, no matter the danger. You fight for your brothers. You die for your brothers if necessary. That's what makes warriors. That's what makes heroes. That's what makes Sky Soldiers. 1966 rolled into 1967. The 173rd continued operations throughout South Vietnam. War Zone C, War Zone D, the coast at Tuy Hoa. Every operation brought contact. Every contact brought casualties. The Sky Soldiers earned their reputation through blood and sacrifice. In late August 1966, the brigade received reinforcement. 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, arrived from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Fresh troops, ready to fight, ready to join the herd. In September 1967, 3rd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, joined the brigade after training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The 173rd was growing. More paratroopers, more firepower, more capability. And then came February 22nd, 1967, a date that would go down in military history. Operation Junction City. The objective was massive. Locate and destroy COSVN, Central Office South Vietnam, the supreme headquarters of the Viet Cong, the brain of the entire enemy operation in South Vietnam. American and South Vietnamese forces would surround War Zone C in Tay Ninh province. Multiple brigades, 8 battalions, the largest American operation of the war to that point. And the 173rd Airborne Brigade would do something that no American unit had done since Korea. They would make a combat parachute jump. The only combat parachute jump of the entire Vietnam War. Picture this, February 22nd, morning. United States Air Force C-130 aircraft flying toward War Zone C. Inside those aircraft, the paratroopers of the 173rd, checking their equipment, checking their weapons, checking their parachutes. The jumpmaster gives the commands. Stand up, hook up, check static lines, check equipment, sound off for equipment check. The door opens, wind screaming, earth far below, green light, go, go, go. Paratroopers launching themselves into empty air, parachutes blossoming, hundreds of American sky soldiers descending on enemy territory, landing, gathering equipment, forming up, moving out. It was beautiful. It was historic. It was the 173rd doing what they did better than anyone else, jumping into the fight. The operation was a success. The 173rd controlled the northeastern part of the war zone. They operated alongside the 196th Infantry Brigade. 4 other brigades from the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions attempted to surround and destroy the VC 9th Division. The battered enemy forces fled. 266 Viet Cong killed, 4 captured. Complete destruction of the COSVN Public Information Office, a major blow to enemy propaganda efforts. In August of that year, the brigade received its distinctive unit insignia. The soldiers chose a design containing a parachute and a dagger. The parachute symbolized their participation in Operation Junction City. The dagger represented the heavy fighting they had endured, the badge of honor that they had earned through sacrifice. And inscribed on that insignia were 2 words, Sky Soldiers, the nickname that defined them, the name that would live forever, summer and fall of 1967. The 173rd Airborne Brigade continued operations throughout South Vietnam. More patrols, more contacts, more casualties, the grind of war in Southeast Asia, the constant pressure, the daily danger. But by October, American intelligence was picking up something big. North Vietnamese army regiments were moving, withdrawing from the Pleiku area, concentrating in Con Tum province, building strength. The numbers suggested a full division, 6,000 enemy troops, 4 infantry regiments, 1 artillery regiment. This was serious. The enemy was massing for something major. In response, the 4th Infantry Division began moving units into Dak To, a remote outpost in the Central Highlands, right where the borders of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia met. Difficult terrain, mountains covered in triple canopy jungle, steep slopes, limited landing zones, perfect defensive ground for an enemy that knew the area. On October 29th, 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry moved west of Dak To the Ben Het CIDG camp. Their mission was to protect the construction of Fire Support Base 12, artillery, the big guns that would support infantry operations in the mountains. The Sky Soldiers were about to face the toughest fight of their lives. American intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese wanted to wipe out the 173rd, destroy an American brigade, deal a major blow to American morale, show the world that they could defeat the best troops America could send. The NVA had picked their battlefield carefully. Mountains, jungle, terrain that negated American advantages in air power and artillery. Terrain where courage and determination would matter more than technology. The Sky Soldiers knew what was coming. They could feel it. The enemy was out there, watching, waiting, preparing. And the paratroopers prepared themselves, because this was what they had trained for. This was what they had been born to do, fight. No matter the odds, no matter the cost, the Sky Soldiers were ready. November 6th, 1967. D Company, 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, moving up a trail toward Hill 823. Around noon, one of the men spotted something. A North Vietnamese Army communications wire running alongside the path. Fresh footprints. A white pith helmet. The NVA was here. Close. The company continued moving. Alert, expecting contact. Around 1 p.m. the trail widened, and then the jungle exploded. NVA soldiers opened fire from prepared positions. The Americans hit the ground, returned fire, called for support. The fight lasted hours. B-40 rockets screaming in, automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. The NVA had prepared this ground. They knew every tree, every fold in the terrain, every approach. They fought from interconnected bunkers, trenches, positions that protected them from American firepower, while allowing them to pour fire onto the exposed paratroopers. D Company fought through the afternoon. Airstrikes came in. Artillery pounded the hillside. But the jungle was so thick that the bombs and shells had limited effect. The fighting was close, personal, brutal. When night fell, the Americans dug in, prepared defensive positions, treated wounded, redistributed ammunition, and waited for dawn. November 11th, Veterans Day back in the United States. Hill 823, Task Force Black, 170 men from 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry inserted into a landing zone on the hill. They walked into hell. The NVA hit them from multiple directions. Mortars, machine guns, small arms, grenades. The paratroopers fought back with everything they had. The battle raged for 8 hours. 20 Sky soldiers killed, 154 wounded, 2 missing. The casualties were staggering. But the Americans held their position. They refused to break, refused to run. Medevac helicopters braved enemy fire to evacuate the wounded. Pilots holding their aircraft steady in landing zones while bullets punched through metal and plexiglass. Door gunners firing their M60 machine guns until the barrels glowed red. Every helicopter that came in was a testament to American courage. Every wounded man evacuated was a life saved. The battles continued through mid-November. Hill 724, Hill 882. Each engagement cost lives. Each fight proved the same thing. The North Vietnamese were here in force. They were well prepared. They were determined. And they weren't running. The Sky Soldiers were facing the best soldiers the NVA could field. Professional, disciplined, brave. This wasn't going to be easy. This was going to be a slugfest, a test of wills, a battle where victory would go to whoever refused to quit. And the paratroopers of the 173rd had never quit anything in their lives. November 19th, 1967. The morning dawned hot and humid, like every other morning in the Central Highlands. But this day would be different. This day would go down as one of the bloodiest in the 173rd's history. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese 174th Regiment had moved to Hill 875, 6 kilometers from the Cambodian border, less than a mile from the frontier. The 174th was a crack unit. Veterans, professional soldiers who had been fighting for years. They were covering the withdrawal of 2 other regiments moving toward their sanctuaries across the border. Brigadier General Leo Schweiter was commanding the 173rd now. He was a former 5th Special Forces Group commander. Tough, experienced. He understood jungle warfare. He understood the enemy. He was informed that a Special Forces Mobile Strike Force company had run into heavy resistance while reconnoitering the area near Hill 875. The NVA were there in strength, dug in, waiting. Schweiter made the decision. 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry would take that hill. At 0943 on November 19th, 3 companies moved into jump-off positions. 330 men, young Americans. Some were on their first combat operation. Others were veterans who had seen the elephant before. All of them were about to face the fight of their lives. Company C and Company D would lead the assault. Moving up the slope in the classic two-up formation, Company A would provide rear security and attempt to cut a landing zone at the bottom of the hill so helicopters could bring in supplies and evacuate casualties. The men checked their equipment one final time. M16 rifles, extra magazines, grenades, canteens filled with water. Some men carried M79 grenade launchers. Others humped M60 machine guns, the weapons that would save lives or end them. The officers gave final instructions. Radio operators checked frequencies. Medics made sure their aid bags were stocked, and then they moved out. The paratroopers began moving up the slope. The jungle was incredibly dense. Triple canopy, trees so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. The undergrowth was a tangle of vines and thorns and vegetation. Men had to hack their way through with machetes. The heat was crushing. Within minutes, every man was soaked with sweat. Uniforms stuck to skin. Equipment rubbed and chafed. Boots slipped on wet roots and loose soil. Moving through jungle was exhausting. Climbing uphill made it worse. Men were gasping for breath, hearts pounding. But they kept moving, kept climbing. The point man was out front, eyes scanning, looking for any sign of the enemy. Wire, bunkers, fighting positions, fresh dirt, anything that would give warning. Behind him came the lead squad, then the platoon, then the company. 330 men strung out along the hillside, vulnerable, exposed, but moving with tactical discipline, maintaining spacing, covering sectors. Professional infantry doing what they had been trained to do. At 10:30, the lead elements were within 300 meters of the crest. They could see the top of the hill now, almost there, almost accomplished, and the world exploded. North Vietnamese machine guns opened fire from multiple positions that had been completely invisible seconds before. The sound was like nothing the Americans had ever heard. Dozens of weapons firing at once. Then B-40 rockets came screaming in, RPG rounds that could punch through a tank. They exploded among the American formations. Men went down, screaming, dying. Then came 57mm recoilless rifles, artillery pieces firing point blank. The explosions were massive, trees shattered, men were torn apart by shrapnel. The volume of fire was unbelievable, overwhelming. The NVA were dug into interconnected bunkers and trenches, positions that had taken weeks to prepare, camouflaged so perfectly that they were invisible until they opened fire. Interlocking fields of fire, every approach covered, every piece of ground registered for mortars. This was a fortress, and the Americans had walked right into the kill zone. The paratroopers tried to advance, officers screaming orders, NCOs rallying their men, but they couldn't see the enemy. They could only see muzzle flashes and smoke. They fired back, pouring rounds into the jungle, but hitting nothing. The NVA were protected by logs and earth and fighting positions that would shrug off anything short of a direct hit from a heavy bomb. Men were falling. The lead platoons were being decimated. Lieutenants were down. Sergeants were down. Medics were trying to reach wounded men and getting shot themselves. The advance stopped. The Americans hit the ground, tried to find cover, tried to return fire, tried to survive. At 14:30, while the paratroopers were pinned down on the forward slope, the NVA launched a massed assault from the rear. The Americans had walked into a carefully prepared ambush, a killing ground designed specifically to destroy them. The 2nd Battalion of the 174th N-Waffe Regiment. Over 500 professional soldiers, men who had been fighting for years, men who knew this ground, men who had rehearsed this battle. They came at the Americans from behind, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. The paratroopers were caught between two fires, NVA bunkers to the front, NVA infantry attacking from the rear. Men started to panic. Some froze, some ran. But the officers and NCOs held the unit together, screaming orders, organizing defensive positions, creating a perimeter, getting men into fighting positions, returning fire. The fighting became desperate. Close quarters combat in the jungle. NVA soldiers were infiltrating the American positions. Grenade fights. Men firing at shapes in the smoke. The noise was incredible. Weapons firing. Grenades exploding. Men screaming. Some screaming orders. Some screaming for medics. Some screaming because they were dying and there was nothing anyone could do to save them. The smell was overpowering. Gunpowder. Blood. Bowels releasing when men died. Sweat. Fear. The jungle itself seemed to be rotting. These smells would haunt the survivors forever. Wake them up 30 years later in the middle of the night. Bring them back to Hill 875 in an instant. The paratroopers called in artillery. The forward observer was on the radio, calling in fire missions, adjusting rounds, bringing the shells in danger close, within meters of the American positions. It was a risk. Friendly fire could kill Americans, but without artillery, the NVA would overrun them. The shells came screaming in, 105 millimeter, 155 millimeter. The ground shook, trees exploded, some rounds hit close, too close. Shrapnel wounded Americans, but the artillery kept the NVA from overrunning the position, forced them to take cover, gave the Americans time to organize. Airstrikes were called, but the jungle canopy was too thick. The fighting was too close. American and NVA soldiers were mixed together. The pilots couldn't drop bombs without hitting Americans. The close air support that normally saved American infantry couldn't help here. The paratroopers were on their own. As darkness fell, the situation was desperate. The Americans were surrounded, cut off from support, taking casualties, running low on ammunition, running low on water. The wounded were gathering in the center of the defensive position, medics working frantically, trying to stop bleeding, trying to save lives. But they were overwhelmed. Too many wounded, too few medics, not enough supplies. Company A was down at the base of the hill, trying to cut a landing zone, but they were under fire too, pinned down, unable to complete the LZ. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. The dead couldn't be recovered. The living had to prepare for another night of hell. The paratroopers dug shallow fighting positions with their entrenching tools, set out claymore mines around the perimeter, prepared for the night. They knew the NVA would attack again. They knew more men would die before sunrise. But they also knew they would hold. Because Sky Soldiers don't surrender. Sky Soldiers don't break. Sky Soldiers fight until there's nothing left to fight with. And then they fight with their bare hands. All through that night, the NVA probed the perimeter. Small attacks, testing the defenses, looking for weak points. The Americans fought them off. Flares lit up the jungle, revealing NVA soldiers trying to infiltrate. M60 machine guns cut them down. Claymore mines detonated, shredding attackers with hundreds of steel balls. But the NVA kept coming, kept probing, kept attacking. It was the longest night of these paratroopers' lives. November 20th, dawn revealed a scene of carnage that would scar every survivor for life. Bodies lying in the jungle. American and North Vietnamese mixed together in death. The enemy dead were everywhere, scattered across the hillside. But so were American dead. Young men who would never see home again. Friends, brothers, leaders. The paratroopers had held through the night, held against multiple NVA attacks, held despite being surrounded and cut off. But they were in desperate shape. Ammunition was critically low. Some men were down to their last magazine. Machine gunners were rationing bursts, trying to make every belt count. Water was almost gone. Men were suffering from dehydration in the terrible heat. Lips cracked, tongues swollen. Some were hallucinating from heat exhaustion. The wounded were in agony, lying in the center of the perimeter, groaning, crying, begging for water that didn't exist. begging for morphine that had run out, begging for medevac that couldn't come. The medics did what they could with almost no supplies, tearing up uniforms to make bandages, using belts as tourniquets, holding pressure on wounds with their bare hands. And the NVA still controlled the hillside, still had the Americans surrounded, still outnumbered them, still held every advantage except one. The Americans refused to quit. 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry received the order. Relieve 2nd Battalion. Get to them. Bring them ammunition, water, hope. B Company. 4th Battalion moved out, moving through the jungle toward Hill 875. NVA snipers harassed them every step. A shot from the jungle, then silence, then another shot from a different position. Men went down. The company kept moving. The going was agonizingly slow. Every meter gained through fire and blood, but they pushed forward, pushed toward their brothers who were dying on that hill. By dusk on November 20th, B Company reached the perimeter. The defenders heard American voices, friendlies coming in. Don't shoot. The relief was overwhelming. Men wept, hugged each other. These were their brothers, coming through hell to save them. B Company brought ammunition, cases of M16 magazines, belts for the M60s, grenades. They brought water, canteens, 5-gallon cans, the most precious cargo in the world. Men drank until they were sick, then drank more. They brought food, sea rations, ham and lima beans, beef and potatoes, food that normally no one wanted, but now tasted like the finest meal ever prepared. And most importantly, they brought hope. The realization that they weren't abandoned, that the Army hadn't forgotten them, that reinforcements were coming. 2 more companies arrived after dark. C Company and D Company from 4th Battalion. More ammunition, more water, more men to hold the perimeter. The medics from 4th Battalion went to work immediately, treating the wounded, stabilizing the critical cases, preparing them for evacuation whenever a landing zone could be cut. But still, medevac helicopters couldn't come in. The jungle was too thick. The LZ wasn't complete. The wounded would have to wait. Some wouldn't make it, would die waiting for help that came too late. Those deaths hurt the worst, knowing that with proper medical care, they could have been saved. November 21st. The combined force prepared to renew the assault. They had to take that hill, had to silence those NVA bunkers, had to accomplish the mission. But first, they needed to soften up the enemy positions. Artillery fire missions were called. All day long, shell after shell, 105 millimeter, 155 millimeter, 8-inch, heavy artillery. The jungle shook, trees disintegrated. The hillside was being pulverized, and then the airstrikes came in. F-100s, F-4s, Phantom jets screaming in at 500 knots, dropping bombs, 500-pounders, 1,000-pounders, napalm. The hillside erupted in flames. Trees burned. The earth itself seemed to be on fire. Surely nothing could survive that bombardment. Surely the NVA bunkers were destroyed. Surely. At the center of the American perimeter, the wounded and the medics and the command groups waited. Battalion commander, company commanders, forward observers, radio operators, all gathered near the casualty collection point, planning the next assault, coordinating fires, trying to win this battle. And then, at 1858 on November 21st, horror struck in the most terrible way imaginable. A Marine Corps, a 4 Skyhawk fighter bomber, call sign in the pattern, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Tabor, the commanding officer of a Marine Air Group from Chulai Air Base, was on a bombing run. He was supposed to hit the NVA positions at the top of the hill, drop his ordnance on the enemy bunkers that had killed so many Americans. His aircraft carried 2 250-pound Mark 81 Snake Eye bombs, high-drag bombs designed for low-altitude delivery. Something went wrong, maybe a communication error, maybe a navigation error, maybe battle fatigue after too many missions, maybe just terrible, terrible luck. The bombs fell short, way short. They didn't hit the NVA positions. They hit the American perimeter. One bomb exploded in a tree burst directly above the center of the position, where the wounded were gathered, where the medics were working on them, where the command groups were planning the next phase of the battle. The explosion was catastrophic. A 250-pound bomb detonating 30 feet above men who had no protection, no cover, no warning. The blast wave killed instantly. Shrapnel scythed through human flesh like a knife through paper. 42 men killed outright, dead before they knew what happened. 45 more wounded, some horribly, missing limbs, massive shrapnel wounds, burns. These were men who had survived 3 days of combat with the NVA, survived ambush and assault and siege, and they were killed by their own aircraft. Friendly fire, the worst 2 words in the military lexicon. Captain Harold Kaufman, the overall on-scene commander, was wounded, seriously. First Lieutenant Bartholomew O'Leary, Company D commander, was seriously wounded, bleeding badly, in shock. Company A's commander was already dead from the earlier fighting. The command structure was shattered. Junior officers had to step up. Sergeants had to take charge, and they did, because that's what leaders do. Among the dead was Chaplain Charles J. Waters, Major Charles J. Waters, a Catholic priest, a man of God, a shepherd to his flock, and his flock were the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Chaplain Waters had been on that hill since the fighting began. He didn't have to be there. Chaplains are non-combatants. They don't carry weapons. They're not required to go into combat. They can stay at base, stay safe. But Waters refused. He went where his men went. He shared their danger. He shared their suffering. For 3 days, Chaplain Waters had been moving across the battlefield under fire, ministering to the wounded, giving last rites to the dying, offering comfort to men who were terrified and hurt and far from home. He crawled through the jungle, through enemy fire, through hell itself, to reach wounded paratroopers. He dragged them to safety. Heavy men, dead weight. Waters was a big man, but this was exhausting work. He didn't care. He saved lives. He prayed with dying men, held their hands as they slipped away, told them God loved them, told them they would be okay, gave them peace in their final moments. He brought water to men dying of thirst, gave his own rations to men who were starving, gave his own medical supplies to men who were bleeding. He was everywhere on that perimeter, a source of strength, of hope, of faith. When the bomb exploded, Chaplain Waters was ministering to a wounded paratrooper, praying with him, comforting him. The blast killed them both instantly. For his extraordinary gallantry, for his courage beyond measure, for repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to save the wounded, for his absolute dedication to his men, Chaplain Major Charles J. Waters was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation reads like a litany of heroism. Again and again, he went into danger. Again and again, he saved lives. Until a bomb from a friendly aircraft ended his ministry forever. The survivors were devastated, traumatized. They had watched friends killed by the enemy for 3 days. Now they watched friends killed by friendly fire. The psychological impact was crushing. Some men broke down, wept openly. Others went numb, shut down emotionally, just trying to survive, trying to process horror that the human mind wasn't designed to handle. But the mission continued. The fight continued. Because stopping wasn't an option. Quitting wasn't an option. The only way off that hill was to take it, to destroy the enemy, to win. November the 22nd, the remnants of 2nd Battalion and the companies from 4th Battalion prepared for one final push. They had been fighting for 4 days. They had lost friends, brothers, leaders. They were exhausted, traumatized. Some were wounded themselves but refused evacuation. This was personal now. This was about finishing what they had started, about taking that cursed hill, about honoring the men who had died trying. The Americans spent the day pounding the hilltop with every weapon they had: artillery, airstrikes. The jungle was completely denuded, trees shattered into splinters. The earth churned into a moonscape of craters. And on November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day back in the United States, the Sky Soldiers launched their final assault. 2nd Battalion and 4th Battalion side by side. 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, attacking from the south. The paratroopers moved up the slope, weapons ready, expecting to fight for every meter. But the NVA were gone. They had withdrawn during the night, abandoned their positions, left behind only charred bodies and weapons. The Americans had won. They held Hill 875, but the cost was staggering. 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 87 killed, 130 wounded, 3 missing. 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 28 killed, 123 wounded, 4 missing. Combined with non-combat losses, the casualties represented 1/5 of the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade's total strength. Of the 570 Sky Soldiers who attacked Hill 875, 340 became casualties, 60% casualties. 6 out of every 10 men who went up that hill were killed or wounded. Those numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. But the Sky Soldiers had accomplished their mission. They had held. They had fought. They had won. For its combined actions during operations around Dak To, the 173rd Airborne Brigade was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award that can be given. Recognition that this unit had performed above and beyond in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The men who fought at Hill 875 never forgot. Some of them wake up at night still hearing the screams, still smelling the smoke, still seeing the faces of friends who never came home. But they also remember the pride, the brotherhood, the absolute certainty that when everything went to hell, the man next to you would fight to his last breath. That's the legacy of Hill 875. That's the spirit of the Sky Soldiers. The Battle of Dak. It was more than just Hill 875. It was 3 weeks of continuous combat throughout the Central Highlands. Hill 724, Hill 823, Hill 882. Numerous smaller engagements, patrols, ambushes, the grinding daily combat that characterizes infantry warfare. By the end of November, the North Vietnamese withdrew back into their sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. They had failed to wipe out a major American unit, but they had forced the United States Army to pay a terrible price. 376 American troops killed or listed as missing, presumed dead. 1,441 wounded. The fighting had also cost the South Vietnamese Army 73 ARVN soldiers killed. The munitions expenditure told the story of the battle's ferocity. 151,000 artillery rounds fired, 2,096 tactical air sorties flown, 257 B-52 strikes. The ground shook continuously for 3 weeks. The jungle burned. The mountains were scarred forever, and American families received telegrams. We regret to inform you, your son, your husband, your father, killed in action, died serving his country. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had faced the best the North Vietnamese Army could throw at them, and they had won. But victory at Dak To tasted like ashes, too many empty bunks, too many names added to the casualty lists, too many young men who would never see home again. After Dak To, the 173rd was transferred to Camp Radcliffe in NK and the Bong Sun areas during 1968. The combat ineffective elements of the brigade needed to be rebuilt, replacements brought in, equipment repaired. The unit needed time to heal, to recover, to prepare for the next fight. But the men who fought at Dak To were forever changed. They had looked death in the face. They had seen what happens when brave men meet in mortal combat. They had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being absolutely terrified and doing your job anyway. Courage is watching your friends die and still moving forward. Courage is knowing you might not survive the day and going up that hill regardless. That's what the Sky Soldiers learned at Dak To. And that knowledge, bought in blood, became part of the brigade's DNA forever. 1968 through 1971. The 173rd Airborne Brigade continued operations throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 brought massive enemy attacks on cities and bases across the country. The Sky Soldiers were there, fighting, defending, counterattacking, more operations, more patrols, more casualties. The war ground on, day after day, month after month, year after year. Company N, Ranger 75th Infantry joined the brigade. Long-range reconnaissance patrols. Small teams operating deep in enemy territory. Gathering intelligence. Directing airstrikes. Sometimes fighting their way out of situations where they were outnumbered 20-1. These Rangers were the eyes and ears of the brigade. They went where regular infantry couldn't go. They took risks that were almost suicidal, and they did it again and again. The 173rd also had the 39th Infantry Scout Dog Platoon, German Shepherds and their handlers, dogs that could detect enemy ambushes, find hidden booby traps, locate enemy positions. These dogs saved countless American lives, and when enemy fire killed the dogs, their handlers mourned them as brothers, because that's what they were. Partners, teammates, heroes with fur. At peak strength in Vietnam, the 173rd Airborne Brigade comprised over 7,000 soldiers, infantry, artillery, engineers, cavalry scouts, support personnel, a complete combined arms force capable of independent operations. They fought from the Mekong Delta to the Central Highlands, from the Cambodian border to the South China Sea. Wherever the enemy appeared, the Sky Soldiers went to meet them. In 1969 and 70 and 71, the war was changing. American forces were beginning to withdraw. Vietnamization was the policy. Train South Vietnamese forces to take over the fight, give them equipment, give them advisors, and bring American troops home. But the 173rd continued fighting, continued taking casualties, continued doing their mission right up until the end. On August 25th, 1971, the 173rd Airborne Brigade began redeploying from Vietnam. 6 years, 2 months, continuous combat, longer than any United States Army unit had spent in combat since the Revolutionary War. The Sky Soldiers were finally going home. 13 Medals of Honor, more than any other Army brigade-sized unit in the Vietnam War. 13 times, soldiers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade performed acts of such extraordinary heroism that the nation awarded them its highest honor for valor. Specialist 5th Class Lawrence Joel, Operation Hump, treating wounded men despite being shot himself. First living Black American to receive the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. Chaplain Charles J. Waters, Hill 875. Ministering to the wounded under fire, killed while saving lives, the ultimate sacrifice. Private First Class John Barnes, Dak To, jumped on a grenade to save his wounded buddies, blew a hole in himself but saved their lives. Cried out, "I'm gonna die, tell my mommy I love her," as his life slipped away. 13 stories of courage beyond measure. 13 men who faced death and chose to protect their brothers instead of themselves. 13 names that every Sky Soldier knows, honors and remembers, aspires to equal. But the Medals of Honor were just the tip of the iceberg. 46 Distinguished Service Crosses, the nation's second highest award for valor, 1,736 Silver Stars, America's third highest award for combat heroism, over 6,000 Purple Hearts, the medal given to those wounded or killed in combat. 6,000 times a Sky Soldier bled for his country, 14 campaign streamers, 4 unit citations including the Presidential Unit Citation. Recognition that this unit had served with distinction in every major campaign of the war. The 173rd Airborne Brigade earned every one of those honors, earned them through sacrifice, through courage, through the blood of 1,790 Sky Soldiers who gave their lives for their country, and 8,500 more who came home with wounds that would never fully heal. These men volunteered. They raised their right hands and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And they kept that oath in the jungles of Vietnam, on the mountains of Dak To, in war zones C and D, under fire, under pressure, under circumstances that would break lesser men. They kept their oath. That's the legacy of the Sky Soldiers. That's what makes them special. Not the awards, not the unit citations, but the character of the men who wore the maroon beret and the airborne wings. Men who understood that some things are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for. Freedom, brotherhood, country. September 1971, the 173rd Airborne Brigade redeployed to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Home, American soil, safety. The long war was over for the Sky Soldiers. Aircraft touched down carrying men who had been transformed by war. Young men who had left as boys and returned as hardened combat veterans. Men who had seen things that would haunt them forever. The war would never really be over for these men. Not for the soldier who watched his best friend die in his arms. Not for the paratrooper who still woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Not for the man who couldn't talk about what he had experienced, because no one who hadn't been there could possibly understand. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't really recognized in 1971. Shell shock from World War I, combat fatigue from World War II. But in 1971, these men were just expected to come home and readjust, get back to normal life, get a job, get married, have kids, act like the war never happened. But the war happened. It was written on their faces, in the way they scanned rooftops and doorways, in the way they couldn't tolerate crowds, in the way loud noises made them hit the deck, in the nightmares, in the flashbacks, in the drinking that some turned to trying to numb the pain, in the drugs that others used trying to forget. The homecoming was complicated. Some Sky Soldiers came home to parades and celebrations, family and friends welcoming them, thanking them for their service, honoring their sacrifice. These were the lucky ones. They had communities that understood, that appreciated, that cared. But many Sky Soldiers came home to a different reception. The country was divided over Vietnam. Protesters at airports, people calling them baby killers, spitting on them, refusing to hire them because military service in Vietnam was seen as a negative rather than a positive. These men had volunteered to serve their country, had gone where they were ordered, had fought with courage and honor, had watched brothers die, had bled for America, and they came home to hostility and contempt. The psychological damage from that rejection was profound, added another layer of trauma to men already carrying more than any human should have to bear. Some veterans retreated into themselves, refused to talk about the war, refused to wear their uniforms, put their medals in a drawer and never looked at them again, tried to forget they had ever been Sky Soldiers, tried to blend in, tried to be normal. But normal was impossible. How do you go back to normal after Hill 875? After Operation Hump? After watching friends die and killing enemy soldiers and surviving when so many others didn't? Some veterans found solace in each other. They sought out other Sky Soldiers, other men who understood, who had been there, who knew what it was like. Veterans organizations formed, the 173rd Airborne Brigade Association. Men who had served together reconnecting, sharing stories, remembering the fallen, finding healing in brotherhood. The reunions became sacred events, annual gatherings where sky soldiers from different eras came together. The men who fought at Dak to meeting the men who fought at Operation Hump. Vietnam veterans meeting modern sky soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Different wars, different enemies, but the same spirit, the same brotherhood, the same pride in wearing the maroon beret and the airborne wings. At these reunions, old men with gray hair and beer bellies would share stories that brought them back to their youth. Back to when they were lean and strong and jumping out of airplanes. Back to when they believed they were invincible. Back to when their friends were still alive. They would stand at attention when taps was played, salute as names were read, names of sky soldiers who didn't come home, names of men who died since the last reunion, the list growing every year as age and illness claimed more veterans. And they would look at each other, these old paratroopers, and see the young men they used to be, see past the wrinkles and the gray hair and the physical limitations, see the warriors who charged up Hill 875, see the soldiers who held their ground at Operation Hump, see the brothers who fought and bled and survived together. The bond forged in combat doesn't fade with time. It doesn't weaken. If anything, it grows stronger. Because as the years pass, these men realize how precious that bond is, how rare, how sacred. The families of the fallen also found community. Gold Star families connecting with each other, sharing grief, finding comfort in talking to others who understood the pain of losing a son, a husband, a father, a brother to war. These families kept the memory alive, put up photographs, told stories to children and grandchildren who never knew their fallen family member, made sure that sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Slowly, the recognition came. Not from the government necessarily, not from the society that had been so divided, but from each other. Veterans recognizing veterans, thanking each other for service. A simple phrase, "Thank you for your service." Words that meant everything to men who had never heard them, who had come home to silence or hostility instead of gratitude. Books were written documenting the 173rd's history. Historians interviewed veterans, collected oral histories, preserved the stories before they were lost forever. These books told the truth, the good and the bad, the victories and the defeats, the courage and the sacrifice. Future generations could read these accounts and understand what the sky soldiers had done, what they had endured, what they had lost. Big and Rich, the country music duo, wrote 8th of November, a song about Operation Hump, about Lawrence Joel, about Niles Harris, a sky soldier who survived that battle. The song told the story to millions of Americans, introduced a new generation to the courage of the 173rd, caught in the action of kill or be killed. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his brother. John 15:13. The biblical verse that captured the essence of what these men did for each other. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1982. The wall, black granite inscribed with the names of over 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, including 1,790 sky soldiers. Veterans made pilgrimages to the wall, searching for names of friends, touching the cold granite, leaving flowers, flags, letters, dog tags, personal items, finding some measure of peace in honoring their fallen brothers. And at the wall, something beautiful happened. Vietnam veterans who had never talked about the war started talking, started sharing, started healing. Strangers would strike up conversations. What unit were you with? What year? And connections would form. Understanding would develop. The wall became sacred ground, a place of mourning, but also a place of healing, a place where the nation finally began to honor those who served in Vietnam, to separate the war from the warriors, to recognize that these men had done their duty, even if the war itself was controversial. June 2000, Vicenza, Italy. The United States Army reactivated the 173rd Airborne Brigade. 28 years after being deactivated, the Sky Soldiers were back, based in Europe now, serving as the United States European Command's conventional airborne strategic response force. The rapid deployment force for a new century, a new generation of paratroopers. But they wore the same patch, the same colors, the same spirit. They studied the history of the unit. They learned about Operation Hump, about Junction City, about Dak To. They learned about Lawrence Joel and Charles Waters and all the heroes who came before. And they understood that they had a legacy to uphold, standards to maintain, a reputation earned in blood. Since reactivation, the 173rd has deployed 5 times to the Middle East: Iraq in 2003, northern Iraq, the first large-scale airborne assault of the Iraq War, jumping into enemy territory to secure airfields and block Iraqi forces. The Sky Soldiers doing what they do, descending from the sky to bring the fight to the enemy. 4 tours in Afghanistan, 2005 through 6, 2007 through 8, 2009 through 10, 2012 through 13, fighting in the mountains, fighting in the valleys, fighting in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, the Korangal Valley, the Valley of Death, where the enemy knows every rock and every tree and waits in ambush. The Sky Soldiers fought there, bled there, died there, but they never quit. They never broke. They upheld the traditions of the brigade, elements of the brigade deployed to Eastern Europe, reinforcing NATO allies, responding to Russian aggression, demonstrating that America stands with its friends, that American paratroopers are ready to fight anywhere, anytime. The modern Sky Soldiers train across Europe, building relationships with allied forces, conducting exercises in over 20 countries, proving that the 173rd is ready to deploy within hours, ready to fight outnumbered, ready to win against any enemy. They are the tip of the spear, the quick reaction force, the Sky Soldiers, and they wear that name with pride because they know what it means. They know what it cost to earn it. 1,790 lives in Vietnam alone, thousands more wounded, 13 medals of honor, a legacy written in blood and courage and sacrifice. What makes a military unit great? Is it the battles won? Is it the casualties inflicted on the enemy? Is it the awards and decorations? Or is it something deeper? Something that can't be measured in statistics and numbers? The 173rd Airborne Brigade is great because of the men who served in it. Men who volunteered to jump out of airplanes, who volunteered to go to war, who volunteered to put themselves in harm's way for something bigger than themselves. These were ordinary Americans before the Army transformed them into extraordinary warriors. Farm boys from Iowa who could plow a field and milk cows. City kids from New York who navigated subway systems and street corners. Small town guys from the South who knew everyone in their community. West Coast surfers who lived for the ocean and the waves. Midwest factory workers who understood hard labor and honest work. They came from every background imaginable, every race, every religion, every economic class, rich kids and poor kids, college-educated and high school dropouts, some running toward something, some running from something, but all of them running toward the same thing: service, duty, country, united by one thing that mattered more than all their differences: the desire to serve something bigger than themselves, the willingness to sacrifice their comfort, their safety, their futures for an ideal, the courage to answer when their country called and said, "We need you." These men raised their right hands and swore an oath. An oath that millions of Americans have sworn, but that few truly understand until they're tested. I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And they kept that oath. In Vietnam, they faced an enemy that was tough, determined, skilled, and motivated. The Viet Cong weren't untrained guerrillas. They were experienced fighters who knew the jungle intimately, who could set ambushes that were nearly impossible to detect, who could disappear into terrain that offered 1,000 hiding places. The North Vietnamese army were professional soldiers with years of combat experience. They had fought the French and won. They had been fighting for independence and unification for decades. They weren't going to be intimidated by American firepower or technology. But the Sky Soldiers never backed down, never ran, never quit. At Operation Hump, when 1,200 enemy soldiers attacked 400 paratroopers, outnumbering them 3-1, in terrain the enemy had prepared, the Sky Soldiers held their ground. They fought hand to hand. They called in artillery danger close. They turned the jungle into an inferno. They held because retreat wasn't in their vocabulary. Surrender wasn't an option. They were paratroopers, elite infantry, the tip of the spear. And the spear doesn't bend, doesn't break. At Junction City, they jumped into enemy territory in the only combat parachute jump of the entire Vietnam War, jumping from perfectly good aircraft into a war zone controlled by enemy forces, knowing they would be vulnerable in the air, knowing they would be scattered when they landed, knowing the enemy might be waiting. They jumped anyway, because that's what airborne soldiers do. They bring the fight to the enemy. They strike from the sky. At Dak To, they climbed Hill 875, knowing it was a death trap. Intelligence told them the NVA were there in strength, in prepared positions, on terrain that gave them every advantage. The Sky Soldiers climbed that hill anyway, knowing they would take massive casualties, knowing that some of them, maybe most of them, would never come down. They climbed it because that was their mission, because their brothers were fighting and dying and needed them, because that's what Sky Soldiers do. They accomplish the mission, no matter the cost. 1,790 killed in Vietnam, each one a unique human being with his own story, his own dreams, his own potential. Each one was somebody's son, somebody's brother. Many were husbands, fathers. Each one had people who loved them, who depended on them, who needed them. Each one had dreams for the future, college, career, family, growing old, seeing grandchildren, living a full life. Each one gave all that up, gave their futures, gave their lives, for duty, for honor, for country, but most of all, for each other. Because that's what it really comes down to in combat. You don't fight for abstract ideals when bullets are flying. You don't think about democracy or freedom or political objectives when your friend is bleeding in the jungle. You fight for the man next to you. You fight to protect your brothers. You risk your life to save theirs. You give everything because they would do the same for you. That's the bond. That's what makes warriors. That's what made the Sky Soldiers legendary. 8,500 wounded. Some came home with missing limbs, learning to walk again with prosthetics, learning to write with their left hand because they lost their right, learning to navigate a world designed for whole people when they were no longer whole. Some came home with scars that would never fade, shrapnel wounds, burn scars, marks of war written on their bodies forever. Some came home with wounds that couldn't be seen but were just as real. Traumatic brain injuries from explosions, post-traumatic stress that manifested as nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, inability to function in normal society. These men paid the price for America's foreign policy decisions. They paid for the strategies of generals who moved units like pieces on a chessboard. They paid for the politics of presidents who made decisions in air-conditioned offices in Washington. They didn't get to choose the war. They didn't get to choose the battlefield. They didn't get to choose the strategy or tactics. But they chose to serve. They chose to answer the call. They chose to do their duty even when it was hard, even when it was terrifying, even when it cost them everything. And they served with honor, with courage, with distinction. That's the legacy of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, not victory or defeat. Not whether the war was right or wrong. Not the political success or failure of American policy in Southeast Asia. But the example of American warriors doing their duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Holding the line when it would have been easier to run. Fighting on when defeat seemed certain. Caring for their brothers, even when they themselves were wounded. Sacrificing themselves so others might live. Displaying courage not because they weren't afraid, but because they mastered their fear and did their jobs anyway. That legacy continues today with every young paratrooper who pins on the Sky Soldier's patch. Every soldier who earns his jump wings and joins the 173rd inherits that legacy. Inherits the responsibility to live up to the standards set by the men who came before. Inherits the duty to honor those who gave everything. They learn the history. They study the battles. They memorize the names of Medal of Honor recipients. They understand that wearing that patch means something, represents something, demands something. The modern Sky Soldiers train across Europe, jump into training areas in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, Italy, build relationships with NATO allies, demonstrate American commitment to defending freedom. They deploy to Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever America needs rapid deployment forces ready to fight. They uphold the traditions, the standards, the spirit of the Sky Soldiers who came before them. And when veterans of Vietnam see these young paratroopers, they see themselves, see the continuation of something that matters, see proof that their sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the unit lives on, that the legacy continues. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, the Sky Soldiers, the Herd, first major American ground combat unit in Vietnam, last to leave. More combat time than any unit since the Revolutionary War. More medals of honor than any other brigade in the Vietnam War. More casualties than units twice their size. More courage than can be measured. More sacrifice than can ever be repaid. They descended from the sky to fight for freedom. They fought an enemy that wouldn't quit. They suffered losses that would have broken lesser units. And they never stopped fighting, never stopped believing in each other, never stopped being Sky Soldiers. That's greatness, that's heroism. That's the American fighting spirit at its absolute finest. That's what happens when ordinary Americans are called to do extraordinary things, and they answer that call with everything they have. Remember their names, all 1,790 of them. Honor their sacrifice. Tell their stories to your children and grandchildren. Make sure future generations know what these men did, what they gave, what they represented. Because 1,790 men gave their lives expecting nothing in return except that their country would remember, would honor, would never forget what they did and why they did it. We owe them that. We owe them our freedom, our security, our way of life. We owe them remembrance. We owe them gratitude. We owe them everything. Sky Soldiers, Tien Bing, Airborne, all the way, forever.